We're going to be starting in just a few minutes, so we'll wait for the rest of the people that decided to be inside rather than outside tonight. You brave souls. Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for being with us tonight. I told Tracy as he arrived that this was Minnesota's weather at its finest. It's a perfect Minnesota night, so I appreciate all of you coming tonight, and it'll be just a very interesting and informative presentation. I'm Joan Nephew, and I'm the Executive Director at the Freshwater Society. This series, our Moose Speaker Series on Water Resources, is sponsored by the Freshwater Society and the College of Biological Sciences. Dean Bob Eldey, who unfortunately wasn't able to be with us tonight because he had just a little bit of an accident and is recovering at home tonight, is also a board director at the Freshwater Society. And I have to say his leadership in both his position here at the university and with the Freshwater Society has been very innovative and enduring in both protecting our waters today as well as building that leadership for tomorrow. I also would like to offer a special thanks to the Moose family for the Malcolm Moose Freshwater Fund. This endowment honors Malcolm Moose, who was president of the University of Minnesota between 67 and 74, and this helps us to fund the lecture series. Before I introduce you tonight to our guest speaker, Tracy Mehan, I am going to give you a very brief thumbnail history of the Freshwater Society for those of you that may have some questions. Actually, we were founded in 1968, 4 years before the passage of the Clean Water Act and 2 years before the first Earth Day. The Clean Water Act, of course, is our center of focus tonight. Our mission is to educate and inspire people to value, protect, and conserve water resources. We have a lot of programs that we work at in trying to accomplish that, and it actually focused on two major areas. We work to ensure the sustainability of our groundwater and combat the pollution that endangers and often taints our lakes and rivers. Some of our programs you may have already heard about, but if you haven't, I'm more than happy to tell you a little bit more about them. For over a decade, the Freshwater Society has hosted the annual Road Salt Symposium, which is aimed at the chloride pollutions from the salt that we put on our roads in the wintertime, and it affects both our water and our vegetation. This fall, our Community Cleanups for Water Quality has gathered over 40,000 Girl Scouts and 15,000 of their parents around the metro area in greater Minnesota that on one day will clean up leaves and other organic debris that otherwise would flow into our streams, our sewers, and into our lakes and rivers, contributing, of course, to the algae growth and all those rest of the unintended consequences that affect the health of our waters. We're also embarking on a new major initiative called Minnesota FarmWise. That program is a pilot program that seeks to enlist conservation-minded farmers in a farmer-led effort in convincing other farmers to engage in fighting soil erosion and water pollution on their lands. And this past spring, we hosted a major conference on precision conservation, a strategy that uses remote sensing and global positioning to put conservation practices into place on the landscapes at points where pollution is disproportionately great and the potential for improvements disproportionately great also. With the College of Biological Sciences, we have hosted this lecture series since 2010. We hope that you have all enjoyed those presentations. If you haven't been here in public or into the presentation itself, you can view those on our website. All but one of them are on our website. Our next one that I want you to put on your calendars is October 4th. And this is featuring Otto Doring, the director of Purdue's University Climate Change and Resource Center. He'll speak on the threat to both air and water of the vast amounts of nitrogen our society produces every day. And I hope you'll be able to join us for that one also. And so I have a little plug here now for your help. In doing this and doing this well, it takes, of course, resources and volunteers. So if you aren't already, please, I strongly encourage you to join the Freshwater Society as a member. Information is on our table out front as well as on our website. So now that I did that shameless self-promotion, I'll get on to the topic at hand. And we are privileged this evening to have our guest as G. Tracy Mehan III. He was a top water quality official in the Environmental Protection Agency in 2001 to 2003. His lecture tonight is keyed on the 40th anniversary this year of the enactment of our Clean Water Act. The presentation is titled The Clean Water Act After 40 Years. What has it accomplished? How do we fulfill its promise? He is a principal at the Cadmus Group in Arlington, Virginia, an environmental consulting firm that counsels public, private, and nonprofit organizations on water, energy, social marketing, and communication issues. After Mr. Mehan's talk, we will have a panel of 3 Minnesota experts on water quality joining him to take questions. We'll have a couple people coming down the aisles right now to hand off file cards for you to write your questions out. And after the lecture and brief summary discussions by the panelists, we'll be taking those written questions as well as we'll have some roving microphones. Mr. Mehan is a graduate of the University of St. Louis and the University School of Law. From 1989, I aged you just a month. From 1989 to 1992, he was the director of the Missouri's Department of Natural Resources. From 93 to 2001, he directed the Michigan State Office of the Great Lakes. In that position, he chaired the Michigan Mercury Pollution Task Force, which negotiated the phase-out of 9.8 tons of mercury a year from the big 3 auto companies that they put into their electric switches for the vehicles. From 2001 to 2003, Mr. Mehan was the Assistant Administrator for Water at the EPA. In that position, he led the agency's Clean Water Program and the Safe Drinking Act program. He developed policies on watershed permitting and pollution credit trading. Mr. Mehan has served on the Water Science and Technology Board of the National Resource Council, and he has been a member of 3 of the board committees on the Mississippi River and the Clean Water Act. And with that, please join me in welcoming Mr. Mehan.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and good evening. It's a pleasure to be here in Minnesota. I made my first trip to Minnesota before I was even in grade school, taking the train from St. Louis with my grandparents up to Brainerd, and of course was thrilled with seeing the gigantic Paul Bunyan statue and his big ox. It's great to be here, not only because of the great work of the Freshwater Society, but the great work that Minnesota has always shown as a leader on issues involving water management, both on the quality and the quantity side. It's been my pleasure, both back in my Missouri days, working with the Upper Mississippi River Basin Association and also on Great Lakes issues with any number of folks here in Minnesota and in your fine agency. So it's a pleasure to be here. Basically, we're talking about the 40th anniversary of the Clean Water Act, one of the most significant environmental laws ever passed in that age of the 1970s, when that great wave of environmental laws came into being. I'm going to telegraph my punch, as it were, and tell you what my basic message is before we get into a more extended discussion. But essentially, the Clean Water Act, to my mind, was a very successful act, but was focused on a very limited number of pollution sources. And while it did a good job dealing with that limited subset of sources, it is limited in its scope, and I think we need to recognize that as we go forward for the next 40 years. I'm also the opinion that we are probably in a period of ferment and experimentation and uncertainty, and we are unlikely to see any major reauthorization or expansion or amendments to the Clean Water Act because, quite simply, the current political environment in Washington, if you've noticed, is rather polarized. And I should point out that we have not reauthorized any of the major environmental statutes since 1996. It's just not in the cards, and quite frankly, if the Clean Water Act was reopened, you may not like what you get. So that's essentially my perspective. But let's go back in time and talk about where we were a long time ago in terms of water quality in this country, and then what the Clean Water Act has done to, quite frankly, improve that situation. I think a major marker that many people use to get a sense of where we were in terms of water quality is that famous passage on Bubbly Creek in Upton Sinclair's classic muckraking novel, The Jungle. Maybe you had to read that in high school. It was a scathing critique of the social conditions in the stockyards of Chicago in the late 19th century. Allowing for hyperbole, artistic license, and some questionable water chemistry, the book offers a vivid picture of just how bad things were at that time by focusing on Bubbly Creek, which more about in a minute. If you bear with me, I'm just going to quote a passage dealing with Bubbly Creek from The Jungle. Bubbly Creek is an arm of the Chicago River and forms the southern boundary of the yards. All the drainage of the square mile of packing houses empties into it, so that it really is a great open sewer 100 or 2 feet wide. One long arm of it is blind, and the filth stays there forever and a day. The grease and chemicals that are poured into it undergo all sorts of strange transformations, which are the cause of its name. It is constantly in motion, as if a huge fish were feeding in it, or great leviathans disporting themselves in its depths. Bubbles of carbonic acid gas will rise to the surface and burst and make rings 2 or 3 feet wide. Here and there, the grease and filth have caked solid, and the creek looks like a bed of lava. Chickens walk about on it, feeding, and many times an unwary stranger has started to stroll across and vanish temporarily. The packers used to leave the creek that way till every now and then the surface would catch on fire and burn furiously, and the fire department would have to come and put it out. Once, however, an ingenious stranger came and started to gather this filth in scows to make lard out of it. Then the packers took the cue and got out an injunction to stop him, and afterward gathered it themselves. The banks of Bubbly Creek are plastered thick with hairs, and this also the packers gather and clean. So before the Cuyahoga River, there was Bubbly Creek in Chicago. But today, if you visit Bubbly Creek, in that area, that branch of the Chicago River, and the whole Chicago River area, in fact, you might see a coho salmon that wanders up from Lake Michigan, as well as million-dollar condominiums for sale along this area, in an area that, while not pristine, is much improved from what Upton Sinclair described. Eventually, Chicago, as many other cities did, started cleaning up long before the passage of the Clean Water Act. But nonetheless, the Clean Water Act did come along and systematized it and leveled the whole country up to a federal standard, a national standard of and aspirations for better and cleaner water throughout the country. Considering either pounds of pollution abated, stream segments improved, or fisheries restored, America has made tremendous progress over these past decades. Former EPA Administrator Bill Ruckelshaus, who actually headed EPA twice, you may recall, has observed that even if all our waters are not swimmable or fishable, at least they're not flammable. But we've done much better than that. Focusing on another community, say in the Great Lakes region, hardly a Garden of Eden, there are more signs of significant environmental improvement over the past 4 decades. In 2006, Lake Whitefish, the #1 commercial fish in the Great Lakes and a key indicator of water quality, were discovered spawning again in the Detroit River in Michigan, the birthplace of the American auto industry, for the first time since 1916. That happened to be the same year of The Jungle was published, I believe, if not the same decade. This fishery was lost to pollution from oil, phosphorus, mercury, and organochlorines over many decades. Since 1972, the year that the U.S. Clean Water Act became law, pollution levels of some of these contaminants have come down 95 to 98%. Mercury contamination in fish tissue is down 70%, and PCB contamination is down 83%, as measured in herring gulls from a nearby island. Now, I don't mean to say that all of this progress is due to the Clean Water Act, but it was certainly part of the effort. The essence of the Clean Water Act is its prohibition of the discharge of any pollutant into the waters of the United States from any point source, that's an important term, except when specifically sanctioned in a permit. No discharge of a pollutant into the waters of the U.S. from a point source. It does not say anything about air deposition of mercury into a lake, habitat modification of a stream, or fertilizer running off a farmer's field. These are just some of the dogs which do not bark in the Clean Water Act. There are no provisions directly regulating these threats to water quality and aquatic resources in the law itself. In other words, the point sources are the discrete conveyances or pipes in the water, which are regulated by the Clean Water Act, in contradistinction to non-point sources, which is diffuse runoff. Again, the emblematic example of that is row crop agriculture. So point sources regulated, non-point sources aren't. Nevertheless, a crucial driver of the cleanup of America's waters since 1972 was the Clean Water Act's imposition of secondary treatment, that is a technology-based standard on publicly owned works, or municipal wastewater systems, if you will, to control sewage. This, again, is a class of large point sources discharging directly into the waters of the U.S. Point sources, again, are just, again, to make the point, are defined as, quote, discernible, confined, and discrete conveyances. Now, today, this definition has been expanded by law to include concentrated animal feeding operations, the very large ones of thousands of animals, but it still excludes agricultural stormwater discharges. To give you another example, I was recently up in Cape Cod, where they're experiencing a lot of eutrophication and nutrient over-enrichment of their ponds and their estuary areas, primarily due to septic tanks, which is the only form of treatment on most of the island and the areas around there. Septic tanks really, although some people have tried to challenge this, septic tanks are not regulated by the Clean Water Act directly because they're not, strictly speaking, at least they haven't been, a point source. As a result of the Clean Water Act and its ambitious wastewater grants program, as well as its regulatory programs on secondary treatment, the U.S. population served by secondary treatment through POTWs, that is enhanced treatment over primary, almost doubled between 1968 and 1996, from 85.9 million people in 68 to 164.8 million in 1996. Moreover, categorical technology-based effluent guidelines were also imposed on industrial, that is, private industry, industrial point source dischargers, sector by sector, for numerous parameters or pollutants. In total, EPA concluded that 65 designated industries or categories were eligible for such regulation, and it created over 360 industrial subcategories among just the first 30 industries alone that were regulated. In other words, the point here is that unlike a predecessor law, federal law, this wasn't a matter of trying to calibrate or control the source to fit the receiving water. These were categorical technology-based sources that were to be put in place nationally for every source, regardless of the nature of the watershed, the quality of the water they were discharging into. Basically, Congress mandated sort of the Nike approach, just do it. They didn't want anything like paralysis by analysis. Again, this legislatively mandated task of developing technology-based standards for municipal and industrial point sources monopolized the time, energy, personnel, and political capital of the Office of Water at EPA, just as Congress had intended, given its concern with the difficulty of, again, calibrating or tailoring the control of a specific discharger to a precise ambient water quality of a particular receiving water. Again, no paralysis by analysis, just do it. This, of course, generated, and this being America, a fair amount of litigation. As it was, as early as 1976, over 250 lawsuits were filed challenging or supporting EPA in the development of these various technology-based standards. I recall a veteran of the agency, a career 40-year man at EPA, telling me one time that he could count on one hand the number of new rules or regulations that the Office of Water had promulgated without a court order. In other words, through not just this, but other provisions of the Clean Water Act, the Office of Water at EPA is essentially in court receivership for most of its existence. For both industrial and municipal dischargers, technology-based permit requirements were then to be augmented by additional water quality-based controls if the applicable water quality standards already in place for any given body of water were not achieved after the imposition of technology-based standards. In other words, you put in the technology-based standards, and if they're not meeting the water quality standards for the particular receiving water, then you come back in and layer on additional water quality-based standards. Okay, so it's sort of a two-tiered system, or a backstopping, or a successive or phased-in approach. Permits, by the way, are 5 years long, but nonetheless it took decades for this process to happen, where we finished getting all the technology-based standards in and then began turning our attention to water quality standards to meet the more ambitious standards of dealing with the conditions in a particular water body. This, of course, then led to another stage of litigation involving, you've probably heard the phrase total maximum daily loads, or TMDLs, such as being developed or has been developed for Lake Pepin. This was in the original law back in 1972, this idea of a TMDL, or a pollution budget, for a water body that was impaired, i.e. not meeting water quality standards. A wave of litigation started in the late 80s into the 90s, and right now, I guess if we were to talk to our colleagues here from state agencies here and elsewhere, they'd tell you their two biggest assembly lines are permits and TMDLs. I mean, that's really what occupies so much of their time, for good or ill. And in fact, now the figure is the number of TMDLs that have been done nationally on waters that were not meeting water quality standards amounts to something like 50,000. So you can see what a burdensome thing this is for a state agency that's implementing the Clean Water Act, and for EPA. The Clean Water Act has enjoyed considerable success in cleaning up the more obvious problems of water quality. Basically, EPA sources would indicate, at least based on my reading, that only a third, back in 1972, only a third of the nation's waters were safe for fishing and swimming. Wetlands losses were estimated at about 460,000 acres annually. In contrast, by the 1990s, two-thirds of the nation's waters were at least safer, if not safe, for fishing and swimming, and the annual rate of wetlands losses was estimated at about 70,000 to 90,000 acres, again, down from the 460,000 acres annually. I should point out, though, that I don't think it would be fair to claim all the success on wetlands loss, or overcoming wetlands loss, on the Clean Water Act. Certainly, U.S. Department of Agricultural conservation programs have been huge in this area, and very significant, made a very significant contribution to successfully protecting the resource. The governance structure, and I think we're going to talk a lot about governance tonight, because it's going to relate directly to what the new challenges are in the post-Clean Water Act era, if you will. The governance structure for the regulation of point sources under the Clean Water Act was pretty straightforward, even if difficult at the time to implement. It was linear, a top-down system of command and control regulation of a large but discrete class of dischargers, i.e. municipal wastewater systems and large industrial point source dischargers. While not always efficient, it has been effective. But it was kind of a monophonic plain song rather than a symphony dealing with all the sources and all the things relevant to water quality. In other words, despite the undeniable and tangible progress over the last 38 years, water quality managers, at least this one, perceive that the forward momentum has slowed considerably. Moreover, many of us anticipate that a recovering, growing economy, please God, will present ongoing challenges, as will the anticipated growth in the U.S. population by more than 135 million over the next 40 years, as predicted by the U.S. Census Bureau. In January 2009, EPA released its National Report to Congress on water quality for the 2004 reporting cycle, as required by Section 305B of the Clean Water Act. This report summarizes water quality assessments from almost all the states and territories. However, it draws its information from an admittedly small subset of the nation's total waters and may not be representative of water bodies which are not actually assessed, which is actually the vast majority. Nonetheless, the bottom line of this report, and I think it's indicative of what we're dealing with, the bottom line of these reports are as follows. 44% of assessed river and stream miles are impaired, i.e. they're not meeting applicable water quality standards for one or more state-designated uses such as swimming, fishing, drinking water, and the like. So 44% of rivers and stream miles, of assessed rivers and stream miles are impaired. 64% of assessed lake acres were similarly impaired, as were 30% of assessed estuary miles. EPA reports that for rivers and streams, pathogens, habitat alterations, and organic enrichment and oxygen depletion were leading causes of impairment. The top sources of impairment included agricultural activities, hydrologic modifications, such as water diversions and channelizations, and other unknown or unspecified causes. For lakes and reservoirs, mercury, PCBs, and nutrients were leading causes, and top sources encompassed atmospheric deposition, agriculture, and other unknown and unspecified sources. And if you're listening carefully, you notice there's not a lot of point source contribution to these problems. I mean, there's some, but many other non-point sources and other physical impairments. For bays and estuaries, pathogens, organic enrichment and oxygen depletion, and mercury were the major reasons for impairments. It is interesting, only in this category, bays and estuaries, were municipal dischargers, i.e. point sources listed as the top sources of impairment, along with atmospheric deposition and other unknown or unspecified sources. EPA and the states have commenced a round of probability-based surveys to complement the 305B reports, which are admittedly of limited scope. These surveys select sites at random to provide estimates of the condition of a class of waters in a state or region, and then this is scaled up to make some national conclusions. In 2006, the agency released its Weightable Streams Assessment, the first such statistically valid survey of the biological condition of small streams throughout the country, conducted between 2004 and 2005. This involved thousands of technical people from state agencies and other NGOs, as well as EPA, working on this. This assessment focused on streams that feed rivers, lakes, coastal areas. It was based on a sampling of 1,392 sites representing similar ecological characteristics in various regions. And again, teams of biologists were all over the country. It revealed, and here's the bottom line, that only 28% of the streams were in good condition, 25% in fair condition, and 42% in poor condition. So again, these aren't necessarily, of the caliber of the Cuyahoga River or Bubbly Creek, but again, 40 years after the Clean Water Act, 35, 40 years after the Clean Water Act, you can see progress is difficult. Now, I had the honor of serving on several committees reviewing water quality on the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico under the auspices of the National Research Council of the National Academies. In our first committee report, which, by the way, was funded by the McKnight Foundation here in the Twin Cities, we noted that the hypoxic or dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, caused by polluted runoff draining 41% of the land in the lower 48 states, that is from the Mississippi, the Ohio, and Missouri River basins. Anyway, this is where it's coming from. I mean, it's a massive, it's sort of the World Series of non-point source pollution. This hypoxic zone has been measured at various stages as the size of either New Jersey, Massachusetts, or Connecticut. 90% of the nitrogen delivered to the Gulf, which is the primary cause of its over-enrichment and oxygen depletion, comes from unregulated, diffuse agricultural non-point sources of pollution, approximately 50% of it from fertilizer and mineralized soil nitrogen. Again, 90% of the pollution is from sources that cannot be reached by the Clean Water Act. I mean, that's what you're dealing with respect to the Gulf of Mexico and, quite frankly, a lot of other water bodies around the world. It's interesting to note, and you'll be pleased to hear this, that the U.S. Geological Survey estimates that about 3/4 of the nutrients reaching the Gulf that are actually delivered to the Gulf come from not just 9 states out of that whole 41% of the landmass of the U.S., including 2 states on the Ohio River, Ohio and Indiana. Minnesota and Wisconsin are not part of the 9, by the way, so I just let you. In 2001, the Mississippi River Gulf of Mexico Watershed Nutrient Task Force submitted to Congress its first action plan for reducing, mitigating, and controlling hypoxia in the northern Gulf of Mexico. Resources have been insufficient, Kel's surprise, but some observers believe an important reason for lack of action is the lack of a central institution with the mandate and structure that match the scale of the problem. Again, a glimmer here of another governance issue. Robert Wayland, former director of EPA's Office of Wetlands, Oceans, and Watersheds, and chair of the Task Force Coordination Commission, argued, there is not a watershed-wide organization with the right mandate to pursue this work, but there has been no champion from Louisiana arguing for significant funding for EPA or any other agency to try to put the institutional framework in place. So it really has been a shoestring effort. This situation persists today. The Chesapeake Bay presents another disturbing case study of the limits of our ability to protect and restore one of the world's most significant estuaries, a watershed overlapping 6 states and the Washington, D.C. It's also an area where EPA is really leaning hard on states and invoking a number of authorities in an unconventional way to get the states to deal with non-point source pollution, i.e. agriculture. And quite frankly, it's very controversial. We probably want to talk about that, whether that's a useful model, say, in the Mississippi River Valley or not, when we get to the panel discussion. Nonetheless, the Chesapeake Bay is home to 17 million people, and about 150,000 people move to the area each year, and the population is predicted to reach 20 million in 2030, most of whom will live within a few minutes of one of 100,000 streams and rivers draining into the bay. The bay and its tributaries are suffering primarily from excess nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment entering their waters. And essentially, it's a dead zone, like the Gulf of Mexico in many parts. The main sources are agriculture and urban-suburban runoff, wastewater, and airborne contaminants. Assuming 100% represents a fully restored bay ecosystem, EPA's Chesapeake Bay program ranks its overall health at 38%, with the water quality component coming in at a very poor 21%, at least for 2007 and 2008. Agriculture is the #1 source of pollution to the bay, according to EPA. It covers roughly 25% of the watershed with 87,000 farms across 8.5 million acres. While some large-scale livestock operations, again, CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, are regulated under the Clean Water Act, the application of fertilizer, i.e. nutrients and pesticides, say on row crop agriculture, are not addressed, again, by the Clean Water Act directly. That said, urban and suburban stormwater runoff, another major source of pollution in the bay already, is the only source of pollution that is increasing. And when you think of that population increase, those figures of population, you can understand why. This increase in stormwater runoff is correlated with population growth, affluence, and most directly, impervious surfaces, roads, rooftops, parking lots, etc., which prevent infiltration, retention of water on site, and evapotranspiration, which thereby removes pollutants, reducing velocity and avoiding increases in water temperature. At a certain level of imperviousness in a watershed, a condition known as urban stream syndrome develops, characterized by flash flooding, elevated nutrient and contaminant levels, altered stream morphology, sedimentation from eroded stream banks, and the loss of species diversity. the stream ends up in a concrete box or channel. Now, I'm privileged to also serve on the board of the Potomac Conservancy, which releases its State of the Nation's River Report every other year. And again, Potomac is one of the three major tributaries to the Chesapeake Bay, delivering a lot of flow and I believe the largest amount of sediments to the bay. The Susquehanna delivers, and Pennsylvania delivers most of the nitrogen. Our recent report indicates that the amount of developed land in the watershed has doubled since 1970. In the next 20 years, the population of the Potomac alone, the Potomac watershed, will likely grow by 10% per decade, adding 1 million inhabitants. Fairfax County, Virginia, ground zero in the Washington suburban boom, has lost 26% of its forest cover between 1986 and 1999. Between 2000 and 2030, models predict the developed land in the Washington, D.C. area will increase by 80%. The Conservancy's 2007 report also cites the local council of governments for the fact that impervious cover in Washington, D.C. area, in the metropolitan area, grew from 12.2% to 17.8% from 1986 to 2000. Consider that it took more than 200 years to cover the forests and fields with the 12.2% of imperviousness, and in 14 years we watched the percentage of imperviousness surface increase by almost 50%, according to the Council's report. Although stormwater is essentially a species of non-point source pollution, diffuse runoff, in 1987, Congress shoehorned it into the mold of a point source pollutant when it wrote Section 402P of the Clean Water Act, bringing it into the permitting program and empowering EPA to regulate certain industrial activities and municipal separate storm sewer systems. This, of course, is dealing with the problem after the fact, given that land use, planning and zoning, building and highway codes are all primarily controlled by local governments, which have the capacity for dealing with the spread of impervious cover most effectively at the front end of development. In any event, the addition of these new sources to the permitting program expanded EPA's responsibilities by almost an order of magnitude, according to another recent report by the National Research Council. Prevention, obviously, is better than remediation, and state and local governments need to become involved in building excellence in, I'm using a term from the old water total quality movement, rather than trying to regulate the error out after the fact. In other words, local governments can guide their communities to avoid or minimize impervious surfaces in the first place, protect green space, protect and expand urban tree cover, and create incentives for green infrastructure and low-impact development in the form of green roofs, rain gardens, rain barrels, green walls, vegetated bioswales, permeable pavement, and the like. Again, making a point, not so subtly, that when you look at the governance challenges here dealing with stormwater, it really brings you back to local government in many ways. Connecting water quality managers and regulators with local or municipal officials who control roads, building codes, and development is a major challenge in terms of watershed governance. Peter Drucker, the godfather of American management consulting, although he was Viennese, once said, "Whom the gods would destroy, they first give 40 years of success." Now, while Drucker may have been thinking of General Motors at the time he made that quote, his comments describes America's current predicament in terms of its water quality 40 years after the passage of the Clean Water Act, because we are closing in on our 40th birthday here. And the gods have some reason to be concerned. There is a flattening out of the upward curve of progress towards better water quality in America. We confront seemingly intractable challenges, primarily stemming from our inability to grapple with diffuse polluted runoff, most of which, like row crop agriculture and impervious surfaces, or stormwater from impervious surfaces, in rapidly urbanizing communities are largely beyond the regulatory scope of the Clean Water Act. For too long, water quality management has been characterized by compartmentalization and the creation of artificial boundaries among and between various aspects of what should be a unified approach to water quality in terms of the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. It has tolerated, even encouraged, a bifurcated approach, allowing unnecessary polarities to dominate policy and practice. Water quality versus quantity, land versus water, surface water versus groundwater, point versus non-point sources, energy versus water, and supply side versus demand side management. The water policy community in America has struggled to implement the vision of John Wesley Powell, the great explorer of the Colorado River and the second director of the U.S. Geological Survey, as articulated in remarks he made to the Montana Constitutional Convention in 1889. Not 1989, but 1889. And I quote, "I want to present to you what I believe to be ultimately the political system you have got to adopt in this country, in which the United States will be compelled sooner or later ultimately to recognize. I think each drainage basin in the arid land must ultimately become the practical unit of organization, and it would be wiser if you could immediately adopt a county system which would be convenient with drainage basins." The watershed approach, which is what John Wesley Powell was talking about, can be described as a coordinating framework for environmental management which focuses public and private sector efforts to address the highest priority problems within hydrologically defined geographic areas, taking into consideration both ground and surface water flow. Arid or humid, west or east of the 100th meridian, the watershed approach makes sense even if tradition and our constitutional system preclude jurisdictional arrangements contemplated by Powell. So it is necessary, and I think this applies to the Clean Water Act as presently written, so it's necessary to work over, under, around, and through the political boundaries, as well as the Clean Water Act, which appear to constrain the watershed perspective. Now, another report came out in 2009 by the Aspen Institute on its recent dialogue on sustainable infrastructure, and this report echoes Powell's plea. Full disclosure, I served on this committee. But the report did set out 3 principles, I think, that are relevant to our discussion, or recommendations, if you will, for redefining the nation's concept of infrastructure and putting it on the sustainable path. And I'm using infrastructure broadly here in quotes. First, the traditional definition of water infrastructure must evolve to embrace a broader, more holistic definition of sustainable water infrastructure that includes both traditional man-made water and wastewater infrastructure and natural watershed systems. Second, this principle should be embraced by all public and private entities involved in water management, and these same entities have a shared role in ensuring their decisions consider and integrate a set of criteria that include environmental, economic, and social considerations. This is sort of the civil society argument. No, it's just not the utility, i.e. the governing or regulating body. It's got to be all the players that we've been talking about, local governments, NGOs, businesses, farmers, et cetera. Third, the third principle explicitly states that a watershed-based management approach is required for drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater services to ensure integrated, sustainable, and management of water resources. The Aspen report states also that water and wastewater utilities can lead the way by developing policies and practices that promote preservation and restoration of water resources by fostering strategic partnerships to collaboratively use integrated water resources planning and management as a tool to examine assumptions concerning supply, demand, and alternative methods of meeting unmet future demand and social, economic, and environmental challenges. The fact is, that today to deal with water quality, a water quality manager is playing without the ball. So much of the expertise, the control, the authority, the resources are within the purview of other players, usually not in the water quality agency, whether it be a state agency, be it EPA, or even be a water utility. Again, control of building codes, planning and zoning, management of farms, local governmental entities. All these things are really outside the scope of a traditional water quality manager, if you will. Let me just briefly, because I Tempest is fidgeting here. Let me just take sort of one sort of concrete case study in the upper Midwest that might be useful before we go into our discussion, just to kind of see how one community is trying to come to grips with the manifest complexity of approaching the challenge of water quality on a watershed basis. The Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewage District, or MMSD, I think provides a useful model, both in terms of sort of the vertical axis of integration or collaboration, federal, state, and local, as well as what I'll call the horizontal axis of societal or civil society integration between private, not-for-profit, or NGO, public, private, or not-for-profit entities across the board. Basically, they've had, like many communities, although I understand you're blessed here in the Twin Cities to have your combined sewer overflow problem well in hand, many communities are having a hard time with this problem in the Northeast, the Midwest, and even on the West Coast, where basically the older systems were designed to control both stormwater, include stormwater and sewage in the same pipes, and they were designed to overflow during a big rain event so as not to blow out the treatment plant and the biological treatment during that big rain event. On the other hand, the overflow has come to be recognized as a bad thing environmentally, and it's very expensive to remedy this, whether you're digging a big tunnel like Chicago did or doing sewer separation, which is a big capital investment. Anyway, Milwaukee has spent $4 billion. That's with a B. A medium-sized city is spending $4 billion to build a big underground tunnel and tanks to contain the overflow during a rain event and then control its release. This was fairly successful in that it reduced the overflows to Lake Michigan, I think, from 50 a year to 2 a year, at the cost of $4 billion. The problem is they're still experiencing beach closings due to during heavy rain events. And it's interesting to note that within these they have 6 sub-watersheds in Milwaukee that are tributary to Lake Michigan. 37% of the annual bacteria load that comes into the lake comes from rural non-point sources and 56% from urban stormwater. Beach closings still occur after significant storm events. So having spent $4 billion, they're still dealing with tremendous controversy and tremendous environmental problems involving beach closings just about any time you have a big storm event. In addition, the University of Wisconsin researchers are predicting that extreme precipitation events will become 10 to 40% stronger in southern Wisconsin due to climate change and variability. CSO events with resultant overflows into Lake Michigan will rise by 50 to 120% by the end of the century. Now, I understand Duluth is facing some of these same problems given the variable climate and issues of more intense precipitation events. The bottom line is to deal with stormwater, which is at root the CSO problem. It's flow. It all comes down to flow. You've got to deal with suburban stormwater districts. You've got to deal with businesses. You're going to have to deal with agriculture in the more remote areas to deal with some of these issues like bacteria, et cetera, and all these multiple causes leading to further urban wet weather events and beach closings. And it is interesting, and I would maintain that Milwaukee's success may depend on its development of a new not-for-profit entity, which may be the key to its future success to sort of bring everyone in harmony in kind of a symphonic approach, if you will, to managing these urban wet weather issues. Kevin Schaefer, the executive director of MMSD, came to realize that suburban communities, businesses, agriculture, environmental groups, universities, and a range of stakeholders had to be brought into the process. And he thought the way they're going to have to do this is through using the various green infrastructure and LID approaches we've talked about, as well as, of course, best management practices on the agricultural land, again, to deal with flow and runoff. Schaefer eventually came upon a prototype. The organization referred to as Chicago Wilderness in Chicago, a kind of collaborative model which includes numerous local jurisdictions with particular interest not just in biodiversity, which was their original mission, but also in more generalized environmental issues. So it's essentially, if you build it, they will come. It's a multi-stakeholder organization with more than 250 members. This organization seeks to raise awareness and knowledge about nature, healthy ecosystems, and biological resources. Kevin Schaefer had the wit to look at this model as something he needed to adapt in his community in order to bring in all the stakeholders to deal with this urban wet weather issue. He basically formed something called the Southeast Wisconsin Watershed Trust, which for shorthand is referred to as the Sweetwater Trust, which now has the involvement of really most of the players in the metropolitan area, whether they're NGO or business or suburban stormwater communities. They're working on implementing low-impact development techniques and green infrastructure. They're starting to work towards a watershed-based permitting approach to stormwater involving the whole regional area, not just the MMSD service area. It has support from various not-for-profit foundations, such as the Joyce Foundation. It's working with the Conservation Fund, maybe the world's second largest land trust, to buy up floodplain, both to meet their flood management responsibilities as well as to enhance and contribute to their urban wet weather management approaches. In effect, it is this kind of collaborative effort, again, on both the vertical and the horizontal axis, to try and deal with problems at watershed scale, which are, quite frankly, only partially addressed by the Clean Water Act, and to the extent they are addressed by the Clean Water Act, as in the case of stormwater, are addressed incompletely and imperfectly. So I hope in this time I've gone through quite a bit of information. I hope it hasn't been like too much like taking a sip of water out of a fire hydrant, but nonetheless, I think it's important to recognize the strengths of the Clean Water Act, but 40 years after, we have to be honest with ourselves and say the law is simply not designed to deal effectively with all the problems at a watershed scale that are land-based and involve so many different activities by human beings across the landscape. Thank you so much for your time.
Pretty bright. Tracy, thank you very much. I think we all learned a lot from that, and I think we're all going to learn a lot from what's going to happen right now from this, from going forward. I'm Pat Sweeney. I'm the Research and Communications Director for the Freshwater Society, and I have the kind of unenviable task of filling in for Bob Eldey, who normally moderates these panels with great grace and good humor. And I'm going to do my best. And we have a great panel here. Mr. Mehan asked me if we got many questions, and I said, boy, do we. That's often the best part of the evening. The panelists we have are Sherry Ensler. She's a research fellow at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Forest Resources, a resident fellow in the Institute on the Environment. Her research focuses on the intersection of policy, law, and natural systems, particularly as they relate to water. She's a former executive director of the Minnesota Office of Environmental Assistance. Prior to joining that office, she spent 15 years as an environmental attorney in private and public practice. She worked at the Attorney General's office and was the lead environmental defense attorney for the state of Minnesota. Brad Karkinen, a member of the University of Minnesota Law faculty since 2004, is a nationally and internationally recognized authority in the fields of environmental and natural resources law. His research centers on innovative strategies for environmental regulation and natural resources management. He's particularly interested in legal tools to promote adaptive management of both terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. He teaches too many courses to mention here, in environmental law, international environmental law, natural resources law. John Link Stein is our new commissioner of the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. He joined the PCA in March 2011 as deputy commissioner. He previously was assistant commissioner at the Minnesota Department of Health, where he oversaw the department's public health emergency preparedness, environmental health, infectious disease prevention and control, and public health laboratory functions. Before that, he worked 25 years for the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources as a hydrologist and administrator. He specialized in that job in programs covering shorelands, floodplains, wild and scenic rivers, and he's worked extensively on water resource management and regulation. And I'm going to encourage all of you and all of them to provoke Mr. Mehan and provoke all of us and come up with some real concrete prescriptions for avoiding this paralysis by analysis that he described. I want you folks and these folks to tell us what we need to do better to keep that curve of momentum from not flattening. I think you're supposed to interrupt me at this point, John. So I'm going to start this off with a question, and then we've got note cards that you've been invited to write questions on, and we've got microphones. Joan over here and Peggy over here have microphones for the questions. So I just wanted to ask Mr. Mehan first. You spoke about the forward motion has slowed considerably, and you talked about this flattening of the curve of progress. Are we still making progress, or have we somehow slipped backwards, do you think?
I think we have made a lot of progress, but I think we're sort of coming up sort of at the top of the curve, and it's starting to slow down. I really do. And I'm not necessarily a pessimist in this regard, but I'm just saying, given, the aging of our infrastructure and our lack of adequate investment in our infrastructure, I think the increase in non-point source pollution and stormwater runoff, I think I hate to use that word tipping point, which seems to be abused so much, but I think it's a precarious situation we're in right now. I don't think, obviously, I hate to avoid, stark pessimism, which is why I always like to start out with that quote about Bubbly Creek, because we have made immense progress here. And on the Potomac River, for instance, where, now that I live in the Washington area, there's been a tremendous increase in underwater grasses and recreation and all that, but it's all due to the point source controls. We have made no real progress dealing with the broader watershed issues. So I think, I don't think we've started the retrograde movement yet, but I think we're precariously close to seeing that happen.
And I'd like to ask each of the panelists, starting with Sherry, to just sort of give your appraisal of where you think we are in Minnesota and where you think we need to be going.
Well, I think the Clean Water Act, based as it is on cooperative federalism, as mentioned by Mr. Mehan, has done a great job, but it also provides a opportunity for the states, particularly the state of Minnesota, which sits at the head of 4 major water basins, to step forward and explore new ways to undertake a leadership role in addressing some of our more significant challenges. And I think that Minnesota, in passing the Legacy Amendment, has started to do that. But I wanted, and I've thought of a number of things to chat about here, but I think I want to take a few minutes and talk about the work that we've undertaken in the Minnesota Water Framework, so that when we passed the water system, or the Clean Water Amendment, it became clear that we needed to address our non-point problems, to address contaminants of emerging concerns, and to address non-point issues. And to do that, we would need to look at water from a sustainability standpoint. And so the Minnesota Water Framework, I think, and the stakeholders that came together in that process clearly articulated that we need to today start thinking about how we're going to link our land use with our water use, link water quality with water quantity, and to approach our water governance from a systems approach instead of segmenting land use, water quality. And so I see us at a kind of a precipice where we have this opportunity with the Clean Water Legacy and the Minnesota Sustainable Water Framework to begin to take the steps we need to take to find new approaches to tackle these problems. And we've begun to have some of these conversations, and we have begun to look at models from across the country. For example, I think of King County, where King County in Washington adopted an ordinance prohibiting the cutting down of forested lands for development. They passed an ordinance that said if you were going to develop a piece of forested property, you had to leave approximately 60% of the tree stands standing. That has resulted in some significant increase in water quality in the Puget Sound. And so I see us looking at some of these national experiments and recreating or using those to create experiments within the state of Minnesota to try to address some of our most significant non-point issues. But this is going to require a fair amount of innovation, and it's also going to require a strong public ethic and commitment to our water resource. That's something that Minnesota has always had. It's something that we're going to have to rededicate ourselves to if we are going to jointly solve this problem together.
Professor Karkkonen, where are we and where do we need to go?
First of all, I just want to commend Tracy Mehan for a very thoughtful and provocative presentation. I agree with him in most of the broad outlines. I think we've accomplished most of what we can probably expect to accomplish with the point source controls of the Clean Water Act. We're not 100% there yet, maybe 80% or something like that. But I think we are running out of momentum and getting down to the last few steps with respect to controlling point sources, and the problems are still there. Clearly non-point source pollution, clearly cross-media pollution, airborne deposition of pollutants, for example, which are addressed really neither by the Clean Air Act nor by the Clean Water Act, and all sorts of other aquatic ecosystem stressors that we really don't have effective statutory authorities for, at least at the federal level. So all of that maybe seems a little discouraging, but at the same time, I think we're at a very critical point because we still really are in the early stages of the TMDL process. And I think there are still a lot of unanswered questions about how far and how fast and how far-reaching that is going to be and how effective it will be. I very much agree with Mr. Mehan that we need to look to collaborative solutions. It's not something the federal government can do alone. But I guess in the interest of being provocative here, I would hope the federal government would take an approach that I would describe, paraphrasing Teddy Roosevelt, as collaborate but carry a big stick. That is to use the regulatory authorities that they have under the Clean Water Act to create incentives for states to take the TMDL process more seriously than some would be inclined to take it if left to their own devices. And here again, Mr. Mehan made allusions to what's happening in the Chesapeake Bay region. But I think if you look at the new, relatively new Bay-wide TMDL for the Chesapeake Bay and the process that EPA went through to get there, I think it's pretty clear that they effectively threaten to crack down hard on point sources in order to get states to take control of non-point sources and other kinds of ecosystem stressors more seriously. What we have out of that so far is just more plans. We'll see how it's ultimately implemented. But I think that's a pretty interesting and impressive model. Controversial, to be sure. States don't like to be pushed around, as I'm sure our commissioner would be happy to tell us. And he doesn't need to be pushed around, perhaps, because he's going to do the right thing. But I think the federal government can't just sit back and assume everyone's going to want to do the right thing here. I think using those kinds of sticks and levers is going to be an important part of the process. And it's encouraging to see that EPA has started to do that, at least in that one test case.
Commissioner?
You know, Minnesota is one of those states that has the great fortune of having a lot of water resources. We have, I'm going back to my hydro days now, 12,854 lakes of 10 acres or larger, greater than 5 foot deep. We have 91,000 miles of streams, ditches, and creeks around this state. We have, I don't remember the number, 1 million acres of wetlands that we still have remaining on our inventory. But about half of our original settlement wetlands still remain in this state. That good fortune is also part of our challenge, because as we look and we make our assessments statewide, we see impairments. We have 3,600 impaired waters on our current list, which is the list that precedes the total maximum daily load process that we use to come up with a recipe or a diet for those watersheds to bring them back to some level of watershed health. Of all those 3,600 impairments, only 15 have been unimpaired as a result of initiatives in watersheds around the state. Now, that might seem failed, but there are stories within those 15 restored watersheds that speak to the value of local collaborative efforts. In fact, virtually every one of them has been the result of locally led processes that have restored water bodies. So the problem is huge because of what we have. The impairments that we have come from the choices we've made historically, the way we've used our land. And the solution is not top-down. I can guarantee that. Because there is increasing resistance to imposed regulatory standards among all sectors of economic and community-based organizations in Minnesota. That's true everywhere in this country. Top-down standards have their place and have had their place in establishing the controls that we have over point sources. I believe the future lies in stronger local controls, more effective monitoring and assessment of our watersheds, and learning from each other how to be successful. I will also say this, that of those 15 waters that have been restored, their future is uncertain because we continue to use land and products in a way that is not wise. And so vigilance is required once you improve your watershed. So we have a lot of work ahead of us.
Thanks very much.
You know, could I, while we're waiting for the
Please,
cards, maybe
please.
comment on the Chesapeake Bay? Because given the time constraints, that is really a lengthy discussion, but Brad is right. EPA is trying an experiment. In fact, I've heard EPA officials refer to it as a test bed for a pretty, heavy-handed approach to, keep in mind, EPA claims no authority over, say, agricultural row crop sources, but they're saying the states, as a condition of your delegation, you've got to come down and regulate row crop agriculture, our stormwater sources, and if you don't, we're going to start ratcheting down on the point sources. I mean, it's sort of like holding the point sources hostages. You can imagine how this goes over in the wastewater community. That said, what they had in place there is something that's actually pretty rare. They had very effective water quality standards, numeric water quality standards for nutrients are their surrogates. And for instance, in Washington, D.C., which has one of the, I think, the world's largest treatment plant, the Blue Plains treatment plant, is spending $900 million to control nitrogen, a little bit for the Potomac, but mostly for the Bay. This is incredible cost. So the point I'm raising is the verdict's still out how much of the further progress is going to come from sort of the non-point sources ultimately, or whether it's going to be the good old-time religion of cranking down on the point sources. So that's just, I don't know. I'm just raising the question. So.
We try to shy away from controversial questions here. So here's one that says, recently, the new head of the MPCA said agriculture is exempt from the Clean Water Act and there's nothing we can do about that.
I believe what I said was...
Would you like to comment?
I will comment on that since it casts my name in the question. I said that the current law does not send the regulatory arm of the Clean Water Act around the diffuse sources of runoff from agricultural land. That's a fact, is what I said. I did not say we couldn't change that or that there was nothing else that could be done about it. I think that's where the quote ended. I said all successful regulatory programs begin with a strong voluntary compliance system. And one of the things we're seeking to do with agriculture in this state is embed a mappable, quantifiable water quality compliance program that's voluntary first. We will see whether or not those measures fall in the right or wrong places within our watersheds. We'll see what interest there is in agriculture for doing the right thing and enrolling in such a program.
The questioner went on to ask,
sorry,
aren't drainage tiles that drain to ditches point sources that could be regulated?
There's a theory that they are. Legally speaking, I'm not a lawyer. I'd ask the lawyers on the panel to, since I think there are three of you, to one University of Minnesota educated soil and water resource management graduate. There's a theory that agriculture drains could be considered point sources. That is yet to be tested in our state.
I would just, and I won't venture to guess whether they're a point source, but I would suggest that if what has happened in Florida is any indication that there might be creative ways to approach agriculture. For example, and Brad can correct me if I misstate this, but in the Mississippi case where the Florida water system or water control system, which runs water through the state of, or through the Everglades area, was moving water from agricultural areas and back pumping it and pumping it into other areas. And they were sued, or the state of Florida was sued for failure to have an NPDES permit for the pumping system, which pumped the agricultural water from one area of the state, of the Everglades system to another, and was required to get a discharge permit. And so that does suggest that there might be some opportunities there for creative lawyering.
Just add that there are complicated and nice legal questions, the details of which we probably don't have the time or the interest to go into here, about exactly what is and what is not a point source at the boundaries. Ultimately, if the federal EPA determines that they're point sources and the federal courts uphold them, then they're point sources is the kind of honest answer I give here. But there's a plausible argument to be made, certainly. And again, to advert to EPA's experiment in the Chesapeake Bay region as a means of pushing along TMDL development, one of the things EPA proposed to do there was to expand the categories of things that would be treated as point sources under the Clean Water Act. That certainly was controversial. Many of those things would have been challenged, but ultimately the states decided to essentially back down and say, look, we don't want to push the boundaries of point source regulation here. And so we're going to revise our TMDLs in order to bring them into conformity with the basin-wide TMDL that was developed by EPA. So I think even that legal uncertainty can be used as leverage if used creatively and aggressively, and I hope to see more of that.
For Mr. Mehan, and then for any of the rest of you who want to pitch in, how can the costs of non-point source solutions be shared fairly or practically throughout society?
If you're referring to non-point sources in the agricultural context, I really, I don't know how you would do that unless you did something that, and it won't happen politically, say tax fertilizer use or use of nitrogen. I mean, you could use some economic tools to, as the economists say, internalize the externalities and create incentives for more precision management. Otherwise, regulation, of course, is the other way of internalizing externalities, but I don't see that happening, at least at the federal level. Now, states have the option to do what they would like to in that area. So then you're left with sort of the question of whether the general taxpayer, through, say, USDA conservation programs, is willing to subsidize good practice. And there are people who will wax eloquent against that it shouldn't be something that requires a subsidy. They should do it as a matter of legal obligation. Where I come down on this right now is I think we would be lucky to hold on to the ag conservation dollars through these hard economic times and concentrate on focusing them in a targeted manner, the way USDA is trying to do, say, on the Mississippi River now, where it used to be, Congress would be very nervous about targeting of USDA conservation dollars. They like to spread it around per farmer because that's how you get the political benefits. But Dave White, who runs the USDA's NRCS, has shown a lot of courage and savvy and is actually now experimenting with taking $80 million a year for 4 years in the Mississippi River and shifting the money, redeploying, if you will, targeting, if you will, these dollars to those hydrologic unit codes or watersheds where you get the biggest payback, biggest bang for your buck in terms of pollution reduction. So I think that's where we are. I don't see a tax on fertilizer. I don't see federal regulation of row crop agriculture. I think it may be more likely to happen bottom up from states, especially in the coastal areas, but probably not in the agricultural Midwest. I mean, that's just a political reality.
Anybody else? Fair and practical apportionment of the costs of non-point pollution? Anybody else? Okay. Do we have any questions from the audience at this point? Okay. Peggy, back there.
I've got a question regarding the TMDL program. So we've got two very large TMDLs here in Minnesota that have come out recently. Public comment period's closed. PCA is dealing with some interesting comments, let's put it that way. And then it'll be moving on to US EPA approval. Minnesota River and the Mississippi River. In the case of the Minnesota River, both for sediment, very little contribution from wastewater treatment plants, tiny contribution from municipal stormwater, regulated point source. In the case of the Mississippi, it's on the order of 5% of the load, and in the case of the Minnesota, it's less than 0.5% of the load. So that these sort of rates are one, well below the margin of safety or the uncertainty in the study for the TMDL projects. And in both cases, if the point sources, the municipal discharges, were able to achieve their entire waste load allocation goal, the result would be one, barely detectable, and two, you wouldn't make much of a dent at all in the ultimate loading. So my question essentially is, how does bearing down on the point sources make any sense at all in this context?
Who'd like to take a stab at that?
Well, it's our program to implement, so I'll respond to Randy. The idea that everyone shares in the responsibility of addressing the problem is true. The degree which the TMDL process then concludes with a load allocation is a matter of public record and process which we carry out. But then the implementation planning goes back to the local units of government and the state agency for the point sources. So that what we will do is we will allocate the loads once it's ultimately agreed upon through the public process what the TMDL for those two that you mentioned are. And we'll come up with our plan as well as local plans will have to be developed to address the non-point source loading. So is it, I judge by your question that you're asking two things. One is it effective at achieving the load reduction? Number two, is it fair? I can't answer number two because number two is what the law of the land is. It's fair by virtue of what the law says. The first one is that effective that's part of the process that we utilize as we develop the implementation plan, and we won't have the answer until we've settled on the ultimate TMDL for those two bodies of water. However, my point is everyone who contributes shares in the solution, and that will be a part of our response to point sources.
I wonder if any of you have thought of the possibility of using the enormous subsidies that are given to agriculture to work with the producers, i.e. the people who do the farming, to use those subsidies as a leverage to help control the amount of phosphorus, particularly phosphorus, that's running off into the landscape.
Well, I'm not aware of anybody considering that right now. I mean, you've got to understand that agricultural politics in Washington are bipartisan, which means they're, I doubt if anybody's going to push that. Where you could really do it, though, is, and with the expanded crop insurance program, as the condition of crop insurance require better management of nutrients. And I've talked to some of the large European underwriters on that. They said they could do it easily, they know how to do it, but that the requirements must be approved by USDA, and that's unlikely to happen. Policy, political.
Any other questions in the audience?
As I say, I mentioned the issue of targeting or focusing what conservation dollars we have on high. Believe me, if we could make that common practice and institutionalize and enshrine that principle, it would be a huge step forward in terms of ag conservation and environmental improvement.
Yeah, I just want to thinking about this and backtracking to Randy's question and John's comment about fairness. I mean, there are some that you talk to, or some folks that say this is as much about allocating who's going to be responsible for non-point is as much about political power and trying to reallocate political power. So one might say that ratcheting down on the point sources is unfair, but I have heard others argue that ratcheting down on the point sources, including businesses and communities, and restricting a community's ability to develop or expand, may increase the political pressure and change the political landscape to a point where it becomes more palatable among politicians to address either on the state or the local or the federal level the agricultural problem. So I think you have to look at this not just practically in terms of the TMDL, but also in terms of the politics of the situation.
Just in connection with that, an idea that's been kicking around the EPA for some time, and I've just done very limited experimentation with it so far, is on-point source trading, it's called. Where in effect you ratchet down controls on the point sources. It's costly for them to get there, but it'd be less costly for them to, in effect, buy out an equivalent amount of pollution from farmers or other non-point sources who may be much more willing to engage in a market transaction with somebody who needs that credit than they are to have the federal government tell them what to do, particularly if there's money in it for them. To the point sources, this seems very unfair. Why should we be the middleman here? But I think it's an idea that has some currency within EPA.
Mr. Meehan?
Well, I actually promulgated the water quality trading policy back in 2003, and I'm a believer in it, but I would have to concede it's been very slow trying to implement it. I think partly because we don't have a lot of numeric criteria for nutrients which would drive it. We are seeing trading in the Chesapeake Bay area. Pennsylvania's big on it. When I mentioned that $900 million that Blue Plains treatment plant in Washington, D.C., D.C. Water, to me it's absurd that they're not doing trading. And every time I talk to my EPA colleagues at the Chesapeake Bay Program Office in Annapolis, I say, keep telling me you have the data to execute a trade between a point source on the Potomac and a non-point source on the Susquehanna. And they say, yeah, we think you can do it, but it isn't happening. It's just runs counter to the DNA of a lot of regulators. I know Minnesota has had some good experience here. What, raw malting? Wasn't that a famous early effort at trading? So I agree with it, but that doesn't necessarily answer the question of what's the fair allocation to the point sources. Now, I think there's plenty of places where a fair allocation of the point sources, are significant and would justify trading. I'd be hesitant to speak too freely about using TMDL as a political club to get people. I mean, I think that would undermine the credibility of TMDL if that line was if Congress thought that's what was going on. I think in the next Congress, which is going to be more conservative than this one, we may see what happened during the Clinton administration, where they basically shut down the TMDL program.
Yes. No, I don't disagree with that. I just think that I have heard some people talk about that as a mechanism.
Here's a little change of pace question. You have one? Follow up?
I was raising my hand eagerly, trying to answer regarding the assertion that farmers are very heavily subsidized. I am a farmer, and I'm very familiar with what's happening now. There were big changes in about 1990 in the Farm Bill. And currently, most corn and soybean farmers in southwestern Minnesota are receiving about 2 to 3% of their gross income is in the form of a direct payment, 2 to 3% of gross income. Previously, in the 80s, farm income was much more heavily subsidized. The market returned much, much less. And there was a conservation, it was called conservation cross-compliance. So to receive the benefits in the 80s, and that's still true today, I think, you do have to meet some minimum standards, which is not to say those standards couldn't be improved or increased. But today that wouldn't really work because the subsidies are really quite low, 2%.
But the Senate bill that was passed last week does require conservation compliance as a condition of qualifying for crop insurance.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure it does, but the consequences are small. Crop insurance is not necessary. So that's a very marginal part of the decision-making of farmers. Question is, I really would love it if they could tax fertilizer. That would be the solution. We need to internalize externalities.
Here's a change of pace question. Please comment on population growth and all of the soaps, detergents, drugs, miscellaneous chemicals, antibiotics, antimicrobial, hand cleaners, etc., going into wastewater treatment plants and into rivers.
Well, the bright side is if we have 130 million more Americans, that's 130 more million ratepayers.
Yeah, I think, we have talked about this in Minnesota as contaminants of emerging concern, and I think that local units of government are especially concerned about this because they operate the treatment plants that are going to be responsible for extracting this material, and I know in talking to folks at that level of government that they are concerned about it. One way that they're trying to deal with it is through extended producer responsibility, where they are dealing with the pharmaceutical industry and trying to develop drug take-back programs. But these are a drop in the bucket, and I think we're still struggling with how to deal with these contaminants of emerging concern.
The other problem is that so much of the waste load is from human excretion, and it's hard to do a take back at that point. But on the other hand, there are some pretty amazing developments in terms of membrane technologies that are used for water reuse and but this stuff is really getting pretty effective, and there's some thought that there may be a technological fix here. It won't be cheap, but then again, I don't want to, we can get into a whole discussion of water rates. Americans are paying half what Northern Europeans are. We could get into that whole debate. But the fact is, these things are going to require probably some new approaches. And the interesting policy battles are going to be, well, I think it's going to come down on the drinking water utilities primarily. So.
Just a shout out to the Department of Health, my former employer here, who's using Clean Water Fund dollars to evaluate health risks associated with exposures to emergent contaminants. And other comments is we're all, look in the mirror, because the products we buy are the ones that we've come to demand. Triclosan is a antibacterial, completely unnecessary for the sake of sanitizing your hands, but believed to be necessary now by the majority of the population. And so it is a very subtle, consumer-driven process. Similarly, look at most personal care products and pharmaceuticals and the volume that is now in circulation compared to the volume that was in circulation 20 years ago is incredible. We're seeing it in wastewater discharges across the state, but you're also need to realize that individual sewage treatment systems convey the same to our groundwater resources, for which we will have no long-term management strategy. So I would say prevention, an ounce is worth a pound of cure. Valuing the ounce and valuing the pound are hard to do, but we know that the front end is cheap, relatively speaking. The back end is very expensive.
And here's a questioner who took issue with Mr. Mehan's Milwaukee model, I believe. With the suggested nonprofit model, aren't we just trading one incomplete and ineffective model for another one?
Well, I don't think it was a not-for-profit model. It was a collaborative model, of which the not-for-profit is part of it. There's a whole other speech I give where I draw 6 lessons from it, from the Milwaukee case. And lesson 1 is this is not a regulatory-free environment. In fact, the whole thing is being driven by pretty strong regulatory impulses, the first being CSO requirements, which result in the $4 billion being spent, but then the hopefully increasing rigor of stormwater regulation over time will be developed, and so it is again I'm trying that idea, that intersection of the vertical and the horizontal axes. I view it as a more effective means to achieve regulatory compliance rather than substituting some sort of purely voluntary, not-for-profit model for a regulatory model. It's more of a mixed regime, is how I would characterize it.
I would also comment that we're fortunate in Minnesota. We have very sound agreement across units of government that 81 watersheds is the right number in this state. Sherry talked about 4 major basins that we're the head of. We have agreement among virtually everyone who thinks about this subject that the 81 watersheds that we're currently in the process of assessing is the right scale for our watershed management efforts. I think we can build on a history of watershed district and watershed management organizations forming to address problems. They generally came to exist because of flooding or drought or a lake or some specific challenge that they wanted to address. We should piggyback on those existing efforts to build stronger watershed-based models for implementation of our water quality and other water management strategies.
Are there commercial objections, i.e. opposition by industry or land extraction firms that stand in the way of managing water resources more efficiently on a watershed basis?
Yes.
Yes. I concur. On a scale of 1 to 10.
Well, you know, there's always some industry that has a history of operating, regardless of watershed boundaries. I would also say I wouldn't limit that to commercial. There's a lot of local government that don't want watershed management. If you look at the traditional view of what Tracy said about wastewater and drinking water infrastructure, that is, we're one of the few, the Twin Cities is one of the few areas in the Midwest that has a regionalized wastewater infrastructure system through the Met Council. But we do not have a systemized drinking water system. That's virtually everyone for themselves except for Minneapolis has a sub-regional system and St. Paul has a sub-regional system, but those communities do not like the idea of regionalized or shared infrastructure when it comes to water. So I wouldn't limit it to just commercial interests. There are governmental interests that don't like the idea.
I think because water resources management is ultimately so tied up in land use questions, any commercial enterprise or industrial enterprise that uses land essentially is going to have some kind of interest here. And many of them are going to be resistant to efforts to manage those resources in a way that impairs their commercial interests. That doesn't mean they all will be. Some have an interest in having clean water. I mean, certainly here in Minnesota we have plenty of businesses that thrive on the quality and abundance of our water resources. So it cuts in both directions. But I certainly agree with John that governmental objections and governmental lack of cooperation and coordination are at least as big a part of the problem here as any particular commercial or industrial objections. We just aren't organized politically, as Mr. Mehan pointed out, on watershed scales. The primary units of government cut across watersheds. And that's true at the local government level as well as at the state level, and that creates inherent coordination problems that we haven't been particularly effective at working through yet. I think that's where we need to go, and I'm totally in concurrence with Mr. Mehan on that point.
This questioner says, in Minnesota, a recent law passed says the state cannot have stronger laws than at the federal level. Wouldn't this hamper Minnesota from developing new strategies on non-point problems?
Don't believe that. The law was proposed but did not pass, from my recollection. There obviously, our testimony on that bill was that it would be unwise for us to be limited to federal regulations when, in fact, we have contaminants that may not exist in other places, and we need to have an effective management structure for our own values as Minnesotans. So we argued that strenuously and I believe that did not become law.
My home state of Missouri has that regulation or provision written into most of its laws. The way it was sort of finessed was that if the EPA or the federal government hadn't actually exercised its authority and set a standard, that it didn't apply. And say in the case of non-point source, there's no federal regulation of non-point sources to begin with, so it is non-germane. Even in the case, say, of point source regulation for nutrients, ironically, you get outside the Great Lakes region, Long Island Sound and Chesapeake Bay, there's not a lot of regulation of point sources for total nitrogen or total phosphorus. In fact, the last study I saw said that nationally, less than 10% of all publicly owned treatment works have a numeric limit in their permit for either total N or total P.
I have a question I'd like to ask maybe all of you. Are there any statutes from other states that you consider as models that we should be emulating here in Minnesota? Any single statute?
Minnesota's a leader.
I was going to, the vast majority of the phone calls I've taken in my career, and those of you out there who work for state government, a few of you I'm looking at, can say that we answer those questions about our laws more than we find other states' laws to use. So I don't want to presume to be proud of what we have, because there's always room for improvement. But we do tend to get asked that question about many of our laws dealing with watershed management, dealing with water supply management, floodplain management, public water regulation, wetlands management. We're one of the few states in the country that has a state wetlands conservation act. So there's, I would tend to say, there's not a lot out there that I'm aware of. Pat?
I guess one potential model I'd point to, and it's not perfect by any means, but the state of Florida divides the entire state up into, I believe it's 7 watershed management districts that are responsible for pretty much all aspects of both water quality and public water supplies and water allocation decisions. And so I think that kind of integration of functions on a watershed basis is a model. They don't always do it as effectively as one might like, and frankly, there's a kind of danger when you concentrate that much power in a single agency that if it gets it wrong and makes the wrong decision, the consequences can be quite severe. There's no kind of countervailing agency to make up for that error. But I think on balance, that represents an attractive model that I think a lot of states should be looking at.
I agree with Brad, having looked at the Florida situation. I also sometimes think we have a very unique organization in the Met Council and metropolitan planning, and I do think that sometimes think that that might be a model that we could expand upon to regionalize our management of water in other parts of the state. The only other one that I find somewhat interesting is and it's a local ordinance, is the King County ordinance in Washington, where they actually are looking at forest cover and ground cover in development permits and telling developers how much forest cover they have to leave on the land for water quality. And I think that's an interesting approach.
If I could just kick it up another level here, another model that frankly intrigues me comes from the European Union. They have something called the Water Framework Directive that mandates river basin management at the entire river basin scale, even where it crosses international boundaries within the European Union. We don't have the same kind of federal structure, if you will, that they have in the European Union. So our federal government can't simply enact a directive that requires the states to do that sort of thing. We would have to do it with the appropriate kinds of positive and negative incentives to induce the states to do it. But essentially, it's an EU-wide requirement that the member states engage in integrated water resource management at the river basin scale. And I think there's starting to be some pretty good evidence that it's quite effective in at least some places, probably less so in others. They have also, by the way, just recently added guidance saying that one of the things these river basin management organizations need to do is to begin serious planning and preparation for climate change adaptation, which is going to change the hydrology through different parts of Europe in different ways. So I think there are actually several steps ahead of us in that regard as well.
Brad, do you think that the Great Lakes Compact could be beefed up to start to move in that direction?
Within the Great Lakes Basin, potentially, I think the Great Lakes Compact and Agreement, which are essentially agreements among 8 Great Lakes states and 2 Canadian provinces in Great Lakes St. Lawrence Basin to regulate in a coordinated way water withdrawals and diversions out of the basin. It has very limited goals at this point. It's an interesting model in the sense that it's a transboundary across an international boundary model for cooperative management of a very important water resource. The Great Lakes represent 20% of all the fresh surface water on the planet, if you can imagine that. That's probably the single most important freshwater resource in the world. But the goals at this point don't extend beyond managing withdrawals and diversions, and I don't think the states and provinces are eager at this point to go beyond that. There are separate efforts aimed at environmental protection and fisheries management and so forth, but those are not well integrated with the water allocation system that's being developed through the Compact and Agreement.
Yeah, the Great Lakes, the new Interstate Compact, I don't think water quality is in its DNA, whereas there are 6 interstate compact organizations that qualify as states with delegated authority under Section 106 of the Clean Water Act for funding. The Ohio River, or Sanko, the Delaware, there's a couple, Susquehanna, that actually are involved with sort of basin-wide water quality matters such as standards or some TMDLs, different things have different. I know the Upper Mississippi River Basin Association is not a compact per se, but it's starting to get into water quality issues. You can imagine something like that evolving into something a little more juridical, if you will, on the quality side. Yeah.
Gene Coleman has a question.
I just wanted to comment that I do think Minnesota has a lot to pat itself on the back about our water policies and statutes in the state. I do appreciate Professor Karkkonen's comments on better connection between land use and water policy and the basin thinking. However, I think Pat's question was a little bit broader. Aren't there other states that are doing better than us in water conservation and water reuse statutes?
Certainly in water conservation and water reuse, particularly in the southwestern United States, that's just become an absolute necessity. Nevada, for example, although it's just miles away from the Colorado River, gets very little water out of the Colorado River because of the interstate compact that allocated water resources at a time that Nevada had a very small population. So they've had to become very aggressive in getting people to take out artificial grass lawns, for example, that just don't belong in that desert climate and replace them with what are called xeriscapes, native vegetation that just doesn't need to be watered or can live on a small amount of water that is naturally provided there. Some of the western states are much further along with respect to reuse of treated municipal wastewater, using it for irrigation, for example. People don't like to have it go right back into their drinking water system, even though it may be just as clean as what they're taking out of the stream. But there's kind of a psychological aversion to the idea of using recycled sewage water.
But it's coming.
And the fact is, on a system like the Mississippi, we've been doing that for years. Every municipality puts it back, puts their wastewater in the river, and the next community downstream takes it out. So we just don't think about it that way.
Yeah, I mean, if you mean, water reuse, Florida and California are probably the 2 states that do the most in terms of the technology and the height. Orange County, California is doing what's called indirect potable reuse, where they use the ultimate, well, they use several processes, including very high-tech membrane technologies. And what do they do with it after they finish with it? They inject it back into the ground, because even though groups like the National Academy say it's almost distilled water, it's the yuck factor, the toilet, the tap sort of stigma that keeps them from going to direct potable reuse, which happens, I think, in Namibia and one place in New Mexico. So, but that's coming. I mean, it's all coming. The technologies, you know, in the wastewater area, people are saying there's no such thing as wastewater. It's water that's wasted. So that's where it's all heading. Pricing, of course, is becoming more and more as a demand-side management tool. You know, here in the Great Lakes, like a community like Milwaukee, not the wastewater side, but the drinking water system, they're cutting water rates, to keep business in because they've got unused capacity now. But other parts of the world, they're hiking those rates up, maybe with a 200% variation between step increases from the lowest to the highest, and seeing 60% reduction in consumption. That's where it's all moving in the arid states.
I think we'll do 2 more questions here. Dick has got a question, and the lady back here has one.
Thank you, Pat. Is this on? Okay. Non-point source is what we're left with as a challenge, specifically with respect to impaired waters. We're setting aside the regulatory hammer, or tool, sorry, and we come up with voluntary partnerships, other models, local control, and so on. But I'm wondering if we've done the math. Aren't a lot of these non-point source land use hardwired? My expertise is phosphorus modeling for lakes, and when I do that, I find we have to convert 80 or 90% of affected watersheds back to original land use, prairie or forest, in order to meet the goals. Have we done the math?
I'm a lawyer, not a mathematician, so I haven't done that.
Well, the question, Dick, is how long will it take us to achieve that standard, or will we ever achieve that standard? The standard is not based on the standard is based on the use that is defined, and getting that level of behavior in the watershed could be monumental. You're right. So the math is correct. The ability to implement is the challenge, and unless we define it, no one will understand the consequence of past practice and stop converting land and making land use decisions in the future that will continue to impair our water resources. So part of the challenge from where we sit is allowing the scientific work on TMDLs to be completed, and then conveying that information to communities and localities will mean that there are some really, really difficult conversations about meeting standards, because standards are based on what the water resources needs are, not what we can afford to do about it.
I would just like to follow up with kind of a look down at southern Florida and the Everglades, where the sugar cane fields made the same arguments with their phosphorus issue, and they were emitting about 200 parts per million phosphorus, and they eventually were told that they had to drop down to an interim level of 50 parts per billion and eventually 10 parts per billion. And they discovered that simply with best practices, even though they were making the same arguments that we don't have the science, we don't know for certain there will be reduction, with best practices they were able to they had substantial reductions. I think in the first year, a reduction down to about 125 parts per billion, and then when they put in stormwater treatment areas, they got down to 50 parts per billion. So I think to simply say, you know, that the math isn't there, we don't know until we start to implement some of these best practices.
We've got a final question up here.
What?
I actually ended up interning for MMSD with Kevin Schaefer last summer, and one of the big roadblocks that we kept coming up against was the fact that most citizens would just kind of blame everything on MMSD without understanding the facts. I can't tell you how many people like yelled at me about all of the sewage we were dumping into the river. But how do you see getting around that obstacle of a citizenry who's unwilling to take any sort of personal responsibility for stormwater, and like get out the message that implementing BMPs like rain gardens is really actually something that will help?
Well, my wife's from Milwaukee, and I can tell you it was a lot worse 10 years ago. I mean, if radio talk show was all about the tanks and the tunnels and the 3 to 4 billion, and not looking, I think, looking prospectively rather than retrospectively, there's a lot going on in Milwaukee. To their credit, they have this Milwaukee Water Council now. They've got some UN designation. I mean, they're really trying to become a freshwater center on the Great Lakes. But this creation of the Sweetwater Trust, it's both a symptom and a cause of real progress in terms of engaging stakeholders. They've sold 17,000 rain barrels as part of their, flow control. I mean, there's just so much going on. Again, it's never perfect. We have a real problem in this society with sort of an entitlement mentality on a lot of fronts, not just on the environmental front. So, I mean, there's no heaven on earth, but I hate to say this, it has gotten immeasurably better over the last, decade at least.
On that note, will you join me in thanking our speaker, our lecturer, and our panel? And please, as Joan said, mark your calendars for October 4th for the next lecture in this series. Otto Doring, a professor from Purdue, who led a group of scientists who prepared a paper on reactive nitrogen, which is excess man-made nitrogen in the environment. The paper was for the Environmental Protection Agency Science Advisory Committee. So thank you very much.